Hi, this is Melvin McLeod, the editor-at-large at Lion's Roar. And I'm joined today by Stephen Batchelor to talk about his new book, Buddha, Socrates, and Us. Stephen, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Melvin.
So let's start with some basic background. I think that many of our viewers will have a pretty good idea who the Buddha was, but probably less about who Socrates actually was. We may have heard his name, we may have heard about the Socratic method, but beyond that, most of us don't really know much about it. So, can you give us the quick thumbnail as to who Socrates was?
Well, possibly we would want to say the same about the Buddha. That's also not entirely clear either who the Buddha was. But let's go to Socrates. Socrates lived in the 5th century BC, and according to recent scholarly dating, that makes him pretty much a contemporary with the Buddha, who was living in the northeast of India, a long, long way away. Now, Socrates is a bit of a difficult figure to pin down. He is considered to be the founder of Western philosophy, and particularly renowned for what he is called the Socratic method. In other words, his habit, as it were, of engaging people, any people on the street, aristocrats, whoever, and really engaging them into inquiries into what is the nature of the good, what is the nature of virtue, how do you lead a good life. Socrates had started as a younger man pursuing what we would now call naturalistic philosophy. In other words, he studied with people who were interested in doing a kind of proto-science. What is the nature of this earth? What is the nature of reality? What is the nature of the human person, and so on? At a certain point, and we don't know exactly why, Socrates dropped out of that style of philosophizing, and for the rest of his teaching career, and he lived until about the age of 70, he was engaged entirely with questions of ethics. In other words, not what is the nature of reality, but how do I do good in the world? How do I lead a life in which I can become, as it were, the best possible version of myself?
So, why have you paired him with Buddha? And what is together their relevance to the us part of your book title?
Good question. What triggered this pairing was the recognition that these two men were actually walking on the face of the earth at the same time, separated by the vast Persian Empire, the greatest empire that had ever flourished on planet Earth. Yet clearly they didn't know each other. They had no connection with one another. So that's a bit of a conceit, really, the fact that they lived on Earth at the same time. But for many years, I've been interested in what's called Hellenistic philosophy. You may have heard of Stoicism or Epicureanism, and these are schools of philosophy that developed after Socrates in the decades that followed. And I've been drawn to that because Stoicism, Epicureanism in particular, Skepticism too, had quite evident resonances with early Buddhism in particular. And in fact, we have encounters between Greek philosophers and Buddhists later in that century as well. But it was only with COVID where I suddenly found myself locked down, unable to get on a plane and go off and do things, which is what my lifestyle was about. I decided to go back to the sources of Western thought and study Plato. And it was through my reading of Plato, as well as my reading of Xenophon, who was a contemporary of Plato, that I began to develop a real fascination with this contemporary of the Buddha called Socrates. Now, of course, superficially, they couldn't be more different. Socrates served in the army as a soldier, as a foot soldier. The Buddha was, a celibate monk who had eschewed all forms of violence. So huge differences. But I would argue that, at least as I understand the early teachings of Gautama, the Buddha, his emphasis too was primarily on ethics, primarily on the practice of the Eightfold Path, the middle way. So we find a commonality, the emphasis on ethics, but also an emphasis on both by both of these men to be somehow skeptical about the ability to reach some kind of final or ultimate truth. That comes along in Buddhism later, but in the early discourses, the Buddha too seems to be primarily concerned with practicing the dharma as a way to ground yourself in a non-reactive, mindful awareness that then becomes the most stable foundation for leading a life of responsiveness in the world, where your practice becomes every aspect of who you are as a person.
So if each of these philosophers in this view emphasize ethics and how to be in this world in order to lead a good life,
Mm-hmm.
I suspect that the word virtue is
Mm-hmm.
probably important to each of them. How did their definitions of what those ethics were compare to each other, and why in particular are they helpful or relevant to us now?
Well, you're absolutely right, Melvin. The key term in both the Greek and in the Buddhist understanding of ethics is the cultivation of virtues. Sometimes Buddhists will call these skillful states of mind or body or speech. Why these things, I think, are relevant for us today is that I feel that for a lot of people, what often lies at the root of our distress, the root of our frustration, the root of our confusion as to how to live in this world, we really find ourselves again and again concerned with the fact that I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. Not just in superficial conversations we may have, but when, for example, we have to face something like the climate change or some wars going on in Ukraine or in Israel. The question that often we are left with is, how do I respond to that? What do I say? What do I do? How can I make a difference in some way? So what this emphasizes is ignorance. We don't know. Very often, though, in Buddhism, ignorance is thought of as an ignorance about the nature of emptiness or the nature of mind or some feature of reality itself. And in Socrates' time, too, many of the philosophers were concerned about the nature of things. Both of them, I feel, took a step back from asking about what the world is, what the mind is, what virtue is. In fact, in many of these dialogues, Socrates himself admits that he doesn't know what justice is or what wisdom is. But he feels that the most important thing one can do is to keep delving into these virtues to get a deeper, intuitive, I'd almost say a kind of a bodily sense of what it means to be fair, what it means to be good. And if we think, I'm sorry, yes.
You have suggested, as you just said, and you wrote in your book, that what brought Socrates and the Buddha together was indeed a skepticism about absolute truths and an openness to uncertainty.
That's right, yeah.
And yet, in searching for the ethical life, the virtuous life, surely that must be based on some sort of standard. It cannot simply be, I don't know. There must be some sort of goal or some sort of framework for the good life, the virtuous life. So what was it in each of those cases? Because I don't think it can simply be, I don't know, since I'm not sure that really leads to much, except perhaps the avoidance of certain problems that fixed views can create. So what is the foundation for each of them, and the justification or the rationale or the framework for the ethical virtuous life?
Well, we find with the Buddha a much clearer answer to that than we do with Socrates. The Buddha outlines from the very first discourse he gives a vision of a way of life, the Eightfold Path, a series of tasks about embracing suffering, letting reactivity be, and then responding throughout your acts of thought and speech and body in the world seeking to minimize or to reduce suffering and to lead oneself and others to a greater state of well-being, which is understood in the deeper way, not just with physical and other pleasures, but actually finding purpose and meaning in your life. And the Buddhist traditions all frame this path to enlightenment in their own distinctive ways. So that, from a Buddhist perspective, is relatively clear. In other words, you're doing good because it enables you to realize your ethical goals. I understand ethics really as about a striving to be the sort of person you truly wish to be, who you think of as your best possible self. So you already have a clear understanding of that. Socrates is rather more ambivalent. He doesn't frame his ethics in terms of a very clear path. He puts the primary emphasis on a life in which, for the Greeks, the primary virtues were embodied in your life. There was an underlying sense that a good life is a life that is founded on the virtues. And in order to practice the virtues, leads you to lead what Socrates called an examined life. So there too we find a resonance with Buddhism, to not just take things for granted as they are presented to you and how you naturally feel about them, but really to embark on a life of practice in which you're constantly probing the deeper questions that animate you. You know, what is the goal? What is the purpose of this life? Socrates doesn't provide answers to those questions. What he does do, though, is that he shows through his behavior, through his interactions with others, how he would embody these virtues and how he does embody these virtues in his interactions with others.
So our thread throughout this book is not only a examination of the philosophy of Socrates and of the Buddha, but also of your own journey.
That's right.
As a very serious student and practitioner of Buddhism, and indeed as a student of philosophy in general, including Western philosophy. And you had very deep training in different Buddhist traditions that would argue that your understanding of the Buddha as primarily concerned with ethics, and of Buddhism as primarily concerned with how best and most beneficially to live in this world, in this life, would be considered by many of the great teachers with whom you studied as partial at best, I would argue. And so what, I know this is not going to be an easy question to answer quickly, but can you describe your own journey from what I would argue would be the more traditional understanding of who the Buddha was, of what Buddhism is really about, to this understanding that it is primarily about ethics, that the Buddha was primarily a teacher about ethics, and even in a way to argue that ultimately we should see Buddhism as a secular ethical framework or path rather than as a religious one. So how did, through a very deep and serious practice of an investigation of Buddhism, how over time did you arrive at this particular understanding of what the essence of Buddhism is and the essence of who the Buddha was?
I'm not sure I'd use the word essence. That's an uncomfortable word for me, but I know what you mean. From my own point of view, I feel that all of my work, from the time that I began studying with my Tibetan teachers in India until now, has been largely driven by the kind of investigation that I was instructed in as a Gelugpa monk. We were told to analyze and investigate everything that we were taught in the texts, and I was trained in dialectics and logic and epistemology. And again, famous statement here, which I think almost certainly goes back to the Buddha himself. Just as a goldsmith will cut and burn and test a piece of metal to see whether in fact it is gold or not, so, says the Buddha, one should test and examine my teachings to test their veracity and not to accept them just because you have faith in me. This is a statement we find quoted endlessly in the Gelugpa tradition, maybe other Tibetan traditions too, I don't know. But it's always been a kind of a standard that I've taken very seriously. And it was one of the things that drew me to that tradition, was precisely because I was being told, don't just accept everything, check it out, test it, in a kind of Socratic way, this elenchus, this probing. And this, all of my work that I subsequently have written primarily, and the teachings and retreats and talks I've given, all stem from that initial input. The problem is, after having spent a number of years probing and examining texts as I was meant to be doing, I found that I didn't accept some of the traditional answers. For example, the best example really is that I was assured by my teachers that if I studied diligently the arguments of Dharmakirti and Dignaga and others, I would arrive at a rational conviction that reincarnation was true. Well, I did that, and I didn't find the arguments were at all convincing. So that already opened up a certain moment of doubt. What I'd been told in good faith and what I'd sought to pursue did not, in fact, lead me to the promised result. But, a bit like the Socratic method, perhaps, I found the process of inquiry itself extremely valuable. And I think as you read this book, Buddha, Socrates and Us, you'll find that I've actually spent quite a bit of the text revisiting my Tibetan Buddhist training and recognizing also the extent to which so much of what I have written and thought about since then has been very much grounded in that basic framework that I studied and learned and interiorized as a young person of 19, 20 years old. So in that sense, I feel that I'm actually just pursuing the same project. Of course, my teachers would be probably rather horrified at some of the things I said. I'm fully aware of that. I get a lot of flack from traditional Buddhists, and I fully understand where they're coming from. But I feel that I'm pursuing precisely the path that was encouraged by my teacher, particularly the teacher Geshe Rabden. Other traditions too have been instrumental in this, particularly the Zen training I received in South Korea with Master Kuzan, which was again a practice of just asking questions. What is this? So again, that was very much another dimension of this emphasis on inquiry and examination, which I was introduced to by my Tibetan teachers, which was deepened, I think, in a much more embodied way by my Zen practice. And at the end of it all, I'm still left with questions. And I argue that actually it's remaining in a state of questioning, which is the flip side of not knowing. In Zen, you can either ask the question, what is this, or whatever your koan is. You can also alternate that by simply saying, I don't know. To actually, don't know is not enough by itself. I fully accept that. But not know is also the flip side of examination and inquiry. You only inquire or ask a koan or pursue a deep question because deep down you don't know. I have in front of me above my desk here a piece of calligraphy from my Zen teacher, which says great doubt, great enlightenment. Little doubt, little enlightenment. No doubt, no enlightenment. So there's a correlation that I found enormously helpful in Zen, and I think it's there in Buddhism by and large, is that the depth to which your questions resonate almost in your body and your emotions, to that extent will your awakening, your enlightenment, your insight reverberate at a similar pitch.
Now, you
Mm.
Used just now and in the previous answer, used the word enlightenment. Um, what is your current understanding of what that word means to you, or what it
Mhm.
means in general? And I suppose I'm not sure whether this is the same question or I'm just trying to get two in at the same time. What is the connection between the great doubt, the
Uh-huh.
not knowing,
Uh-huh.
which leads to a direct, immediate experience, hopefully, of the nature of reality, not based on fixed concepts or ideas, and ethics? Because one seems to take place at a open level, shall we say, and the other seems to specifically address concrete relative world actions that we would take now. So, two questions to you: what is enlightenment, and what is the connection between uncertainty and great doubt and ethics? Why does great doubt maybe lead on one hand to a direct immediate experience of the nature of mind and reality, and on the other hand lead to a specifically ethical or virtuous life?
Okay. Um, okay. So my understanding of enlightenment, although I personally prefer to use the word awakening, I think it's more literal. It also has the advantage of being a gerund. It can suggest a process as well as a goal. So let's use the word awakening. Um, I go by the Buddha's initial definition of what awakening is, that we find at the conclusion of the Buddha's first discourse, which is called Turning the Wheel of Dharma. There you see very, very clearly how he defines it. He defines it as he says, I'll quote him more or less verbatim. It was not until my knowledge and wisdom were entirely clear about the recognition, the performance, and the mastery of four tasks. He doesn't actually use the word task, but he uses the four actions that we pursue in relation to what he calls the Four Noble Truths. So, in other words, uh, until the Buddha had fully understood dukkha, suffering, had let reactivity or craving, greed, delusion fall away, come to a stop, had settled into the non-reactive space of nibbana, of clear cognition, and until he had mastered the 8 steps of the Eightfold Path, he could not consider himself to be fully awake. Now, this is a definition that is there in the Buddha's first discourse, and it is largely forgotten by Buddhists. And they might find it a bit strange to hear that. Go and look at the text. It's only a couple of pages long. And here you have a very different picture of what awakening is about. There's not a single mention of awakening being about gaining insight into the nature of ultimate reality or the nature of mind. Not there. It's about recognizing certain tasks that need to be formed, learning how to perform them, and mastering those tasks. And at that point, we can talk about awakening. Now, if we stick to that particular model of awakening, then I think it follows fairly naturally that the consequences of this awakening are about learning how to respond non-reactively to the situations of suffering in the world, and to embody those in your thoughts, in your speech, in your words, in your deeds, in your work, all of the steps of the Eightfold Path. So I take the Eightfold Path not as the Eightfold Path that leads to the end of suffering, although it may do that too, but the Eightfold Path that actually emerges from a mind that has come to a stop, maybe just temporarily, has found a stillness and quietness and clarity through having let go, having no longer being entangled in your attachments and your fears and your desires and your opinions, in such a way that a space opens up that you are then able to make more appropriate judgments in about how you respond to your own feelings, your own inner workings, as well as the suffering and the problems others have. And we could extend that to the state of the world or whatever you wish.
you talk in your book about wanting to or the need for what you call a rigorously secular dharma,
Yeah.
and indeed a worldly eightfold path. And you yourself provide your own description of 8 elements of the good life, I think is fair to say.
Yeah.
But indeed is not the traditional eightfold path, which I think we can summarize as mindfulness, wisdom, and ethical living, which is
Mhm.
then broken down into various categories,
Mhm.
but itself actually completely secular
Mhm.
and aimed at our life in this world now.
Mhm.
So to me, the question is, to what extent your desire to offer a quote rigorously secular dharma
Yeah.
is indeed an attempt to go back earlier than the subsequent world religion that developed around the Buddha's teachings,
Yeah.
particularly as embodied by the later Mahayana tradition.
Mhm.
So is that fundamentally to you what a secular or non-religious dharma is about? Really jettisoning much of the mythology or belief systems of the later world
Mhm.
religion that developed around the original teachings of the Buddha.
Yeah, pretty much. If I'm entirely frank, yes. Um, on the other hand, I do not. I'm not a fundamentalist in the sense that I want to go back to what the Buddha, as far as we can tell, what the Buddha said, and jettison everything else and rebuild the Dharma or a contemporary secular Dharma from that base. To some extent, that's the case, but I draw a great deal from Zen Buddhism. I also draw a considerable amount from figures like Shantideva and others, and these are, again, quite clear from my writings. And I've recently actually become very interested in Pure Land Buddhism, believe it or not. I'm very, very inspired by the life of Shinran Shonin. I've spent time in Japan recently working with Shin Buddhists. And that is an approach I find not so well known in the West, really, but one in some ways that is a kind of a precursor of a secular Dharma. I would say the first secular Buddhist was Shinran, actually. But again, this is not the moment to get into that. Um, so, yes, I fully understand that what I have said and written and in public has some Buddhists have found rather objectionable. And I fully understand that. But at the same time, I'm concerned about finding a Dharma that is speaking very much to the condition of our times. We're also looking at a Dharma that we now understand not just through the traditional religious traditions, but also through modern scholarship. I think we have a much more critical understanding, an historical critical understanding of how these texts and traditions evolved and emerged in different Asian cultures and societies, and how each of them took on different characteristics that were very much of those societies in which they emerged. And so we see that Buddhism is not, I find it very difficult to think of a sort of an unbroken oral tradition that goes back to the Buddha that's never been modified or tampered with, which is a kind of view that you'll find in Zen, you'll find it in the Tibetan tradition and elsewhere. I think that's somewhat naive. And I feel we need to take into account the historicity of the Dharma, the contingency of Buddhism itself. And Buddhists are very good at saying that all conditioned things are impermanent and unsatisfactory and devoid of any essence, except their particular tradition of Buddhism, which doesn't seem to suffer from those problems. It's going to go on forever, and there's something eternal in the enlightened mind of our teacher, perhaps, or something like that. I don't find any of that really very helpful anymore. I feel we need to somehow take a deep breath and, in full respect of the 2,500 years of history of this tradition, recognize that modernity, post-modernity, a scientifically informed world, a post-Christian society is not the one in which most of the Buddhist teachings were ever given. Of course, our basic human condition is the same, but the way in which we respond authentically and in a wiser, more caring way about that human condition requires that we find a language, we find forms of practice, we find forms of community structure. We have to look into questions of power and authority as well. And all of that, I think, is, in a sense, being thrown up into the air through the extraordinary impact of Buddhism on modernity and modernity on Buddhism. And I find myself really as someone who's given their life to this, and I try to remain true to the earliest sources that I've already quoted here, the inspiration of my primary teachers, Geshe Rabten and Kuzan Sunim, not to suggest that they would agree with what I'm doing, but what these men were in my lives were people against whom I could measure myself. They stood as very sound, authentic people on this earth, without whom I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now. So I feel, in a way, I'm seeking to embody their spirit in my work I do, not simply to preserve what they have taught me. It's a bit of both, obviously. And that's where I feel my karma, if you want to call it that, has led me in this life. And all I can do is hope that my motivation has been good, that I have revealed, or at least thrown into the arena, questions that I feel really do need to be answered. I don't think you can just keep repeating standard Buddhist dogmas to somehow just quieten any objection. I think we need a much more critical encounter with the Dharma in order to actually bring it alive, not only in our own inner lives, but in the world and the society in which we find ourselves now.
So if the kind of dharma, to use a Buddhist term, that you feel the world needs is secular and transformative and addresses how to live in this life in order to benefit ourselves and others and society, isn't that best fulfilled, currently being fulfilled, and in fact is effectively being fulfilled by what we might know as the secular or mainstream mindfulness movement? Mm-hmm. Particularly if we were to define mindfulness not simply in the traditional sense as a helpful practice about being present, but as a complete path of life that leads naturally to things like compassion, to ethics, to connection. So to what extent do you feel that, and that path of mindfulness in its as a complete life, which indeed mirrors much of the fundamental teachings of the Buddha, is not inherently Buddhist, but simply represents universal truths, universal human aspirations, and universal human capabilities? So to what extent is the kind of, quote, rigorously secular dharma that you feel we and the world need at this point, in fact, being fulfilled effectively and most effectively now by what we might call the mainstream mindfulness movement, rather than anything we might keep the label of Buddhist on?
Very good question, and broadly, and my answer is yes and no. I do feel that in the 50 years in which I've been involved in Buddhism, and in which books have been published and Buddhist teachers have been now all over the West, the most impactful and most, in a sense, I think most potent moment was when John Kabat-Zinn came up with mindfulness-based stress reduction, applied it in medical circumstances, and then quite quickly this idea took off. And Buddhism was then, suddenly something that was a religious tradition that actually had a methodology that could be tested and shown to work. Now, this, I think, was an extraordinary thing. It still blows my mind, frankly. And if I'd been told in the 1970s, my friends in India, in 40 years' time, you'll be able to get Buddhist meditation on the health service, I would have thought they were crazy, actually. Now, on the other hand, so yes, I think that what Kabat-Zinn and others have done in introducing this now large secular movement of mindfulness, which they call secular mindfulness, that does in fact go quite some way towards the kind of vision I have. But I think it's inadequate. And I think it's inadequate for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is because the two primary forms of mindfulness-based intervention, which is mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, both of these and other interventions are largely concerned with resolving a problem, stress, depression, anxiety. The medicalization of mindfulness has inevitably put it in the framework of healing, of curing, which is, of course, important. But that, to me, is only a relatively small part of what the Dharma does. And in order to address what I see as the limitations in the mindfulness movement today, I have developed in conjunction with some colleagues in Germany, another mindfulness-based intervention, which is called mindfulness-based ethical living. I ran a program on this during COVID, actually, or shortly after. And this has now then been scaled up and developed by people who are, in fact, mindfulness teachers, but who are looking for a mindfulness-based practice that is not about getting rid of anxiety or stress or whatever, but is a mindfulness-based approach to living more fully, to living a life in which you truly flourish as a person. In other words, it follows this model of these tasks that I've mentioned, starting with embracing life, letting reactivity be, observing it stop, and then cultivating this way of life, the Eightfold Path, which is really what we could also call a way of living ethically on this earth. But it's a form of practice that is grounded in a deeper contemplative experience, which I would call contemplative mindfulness. It also has worked through the more therapeutic dimensions of mindfulness. It likewise recognizes mindfulness as existential in the sense that we are mindful of our body, our minds, our world, other people. But crucially, it's the fourth kind of mindfulness, which I would call relational mindfulness, that works within the framework of the Eightfold Path, that we can begin to see a picture emerging of a complex way of life that's not reducible just to doing certain mindfulness practices in the course of the day, but is integrated into an entire way of seeing the world, the kind of persons we are, the kind of societies we live in, and utilizing mindfulness as a foundation or as a basis to bring out all that is potential in a human person and in a human society. So that's my attempt, and this is now being run as a pilot program in Germany. I don't know how it's going to evolve, but I'm very concerned, in fact, not to let secular mindfulness somehow dominate the field, but to take that very promising beginning to develop a far more complex, rigorous, and hopefully insightful and compassionate way of life that is much much closer to the range of skills and ideas and philosophies that we find in Buddhism. So I do feel it needs to be further expanded, the whole mindfulness movement. And likewise, I'm not particularly attached to the idea of secular Buddhism, for example. I mean, I'd be quite happy to drop that term. I think it is a sort of a way station, maybe, a sort of a step that might be helpful to take. But whether that will be the final goal, I don't know.
Yes, I think you've pointed to what I feel is the historic challenge we're now facing. I look upon the mainstream or secular mindfulness movement as a new and authentic contemplative tradition that is brilliantly designed for the modern world, that got its foundation, as you described, in MBSR, in the practice of mindfulness and in its concrete benefits. And through that innovation, has got millions of people practicing mindfulness. So I look upon this as the first step in the historic development of a new contemplative tradition, which I think very much mimics what you've described. And now the task before us is to help that movement to take its next step forward, to define mindfulness much more deeply and much more broadly, in the very ways that you described. And I think there'll be different models for that. In Lion's Roar, we presented a model we're calling the Complete Path of Mindfulness, which will be the subject of a book that will come out by me next year from Shambhala Publications. But basically, that's one model. You may offer through your mindfulness-based ethical living model something a little different, although I suspect there's a great deal of overlap. But the main thing is that no matter how we would define what that next step will be in the both expansion and deepening of the mindfulness movement, the key is to take that step and recognize its necessity in order to create a much more transformative and powerful path that offers the kind of benefit that people have traditionally associated with capital R religion, that is available to those who either are not interested in a religious path or not interested in following any particular path, but have a kind of universal human path that offers the kind of powerful and deep and social transformation that you've described. And I think that's the step before us now, is to help that make that historic development of the mindfulness movement take this next step in its important development in the ways that you have described and the ways we have tried to describe through the Complete Path of Mindfulness.
Well, that sounds wonderful. I think I think we are actually moving in a very similar direction. And so I'm very grateful to the mindfulness movement, and I'm finding more and more people within the mindfulness movement are now reading my Buddhist books. So it's, you see, I get a lot of people who write to me saying, look, I've been practicing mindfulness for X number of years or whatever. And then I realize that it's actually part of the Buddhist tradition, not too difficult to find out. But when they actually go to the nearest Buddhist center, they're not interested in what's going on there. In fact, they often feel an aversion to it. They may have left Christianity or whatever some time ago, and they find themselves, confronted with what looks like another traditional religious institution with, authority figures and rituals and chanting and all that sort of stuff. And that's not what they're into. They don't necessarily dislike it, but there's not something they're going to sort of, happily just sit down and become part of. And so I think a lot of the Buddhist traditions are struggling with how to actually generate forms of practice and philosophy that do not weaken or somehow trivialize the traditional teachings and practices, but enable them to somehow be available in a non-alienating language, a non-alienating form for people who have already got a foundation in Buddhist practice. Because once you get mindfulness, and it's very simple, it's not easy to do, it's very simple to understand how it's about stopping, stepping back, seeing what's going on rather than getting caught up and entangled in it all. And whether you're a monk in a Burmese forest monastery or you're a housewife in Chicago, you're doing exactly the same thing. Once you begin to recognize what the core moves are in mindfulness, you have a much better way, I think, of then integrating that into other forms of practice that might likewise become more secularized. We don't know. But again, these sort of transitions of something as long-lived and complex as Buddhism and all its different traditions, it's not going to find a new form overnight. We've been at this game for what, Melvin, 50 years or so? And yeah, we've seen some developments and changes, but we can also see a lot of things are refusing to budge. And I think this points to the fact that the Dharma is, when it travels from one culture or one historical period to another, it does so over generations. It doesn't do so because some clever person wrote a book or some great guru gave some teaching. It has to be integrated into our lives at a much more sort of sensorial culturally appropriate level. And that, I think, is what has happened in the course of our lifetimes in the last 50 years, is that the currents of a non-Western form of religious, spiritual, existential practice have beginning to take root in our society. I feel that very possibly the next step in the evolution of Buddhism worldwide might well come from Asia, actually, from China, from Japan, from Korea, from Tibet, wherever. I think we're on the cusp of another change, and I'm not sure it's going to come from the West anymore.
Well, Stephen Batchelor, I want to thank you for this conversation and, more importantly, for your ongoing contribution, obviously looking toward the future based on your long and deep study of Buddhism, in order to present the Dharma in an evolving way that will be most beneficial to our lives and to our society. And I think even for those of us who are reaching the end of our careers, of our spiritual path, of our lives, God forbid, that this is an exciting time. And I thank you very much for your contribution to it. And I think it will be really, really fun and great to see where all this leads now. So, Stephen Batchelor, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed, Melvin. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I wish you all well, those of you who are listening. Bye.